So what we were going to do now then is just kind of briefly pull threads together, or attempt to pull threads together from the last 24 hours or so. If anyone wants to ask a question, please just put your hand up, or you can put questions on Slido. If you want to make a point, again, just please put your hand up, and we can bring you into the conversation. There were three big themes I picked up from the discussions. So the first is the whole notion of complexity and risk, and what is investable and when is something investable. So it's about allocating capital to risk. The second is around time frames and around the long term and the short term. And the third is around the concept of systems thinking and bringing things together. Did anyone want to kick off with any kind of immediate kind of gut feelings on the last 24 hours or so in terms of immediate observations they had? Let me guide the conversation a bit in that case. So in terms of complexity and risk and what's investable, we talked about nature and we talked about infrastructure and the energy transition. On nature, we had what will go down in history as the Campbell-Rose debate about putting a price on essentially how do investors get over the hurdle of the risk of investing in nature, and that it is perceived as a risky or kind of hard to know asset class, and that's contrasting with the kind of the voice of nature, as it were, which is that we need to be investing in nature. Did anyone have any reflections on how we might start to kind of bridge that gap? Because it certainly from my perspective, it really feels like there's a lot of appetite from investors, from institutional investors, to be investing in nature. There's a lot of amazing work going on, but there's a lot of work to doing in terms of kind of bridging that gap.
I think the fan idea was very good at bringing together some of those parts, because we are quite close, and we have friends and colleagues who are doing this, right? And making a reasonable fist of it. With capital being raised in numbers that are significant. But what we don't have is an overarching structure that allows many decisions to be made in that direction by many different types of investors. So we don't have constitutional principles that value nature in our society. We don't have a mandate for our major financial institutions, public or private, that includes nature. And Lord knows we tried when the UK Investment Infrastructure Bank was being created. I and many others put a lot of effort into trying to create a mandate for nature in the Mem and Arts, the purposes of that institution, tried to get it into a statute and failed. We got a net zero interpretation that included nature, but it was less than it should have been. And then you need to get that to feed all the way through, so the constituent instruments of companies, the obligations of directors, you need to push it all the way through a whole series of decision makers for it to fundamentally alter the way capital flows and to help us do something serious and sustainable about investing in natural. And that does involve some kind of pricing mechanism, even if that is only ever going to be partial and never adequate to properly value nature and natural systems. And that, to my mind, initially is a philosophical challenge that becomes political and then becomes institutional and legal and then financial. And at the moment, what we've got is some pretty good, worthy experiments which some of us are involved in trying to do this as a front runner, as a pioneer. But the real challenge is in these other spaces, in the public realm, in public discourse, and in public law.
I would actually put it out to the audience. We've got a question here from Andrew, so if we can bring a mic over, that would be great. If anyone in the audience, investors or kind of voice of investors, if you had any more reflections, given Kate's question yesterday about the kind of perceived risk of nature by institutional investors, has any of this discussion kind of changed your mind at all? Has your thinking evolved? Feel free to contribute. Andrew, you have a point there?
Yeah, An observation of news of this morning and a supplement to the presentation on the nature case. It's timely today that Natural England have published their natural capital status report this morning. You can read the highlights of it on the government web pages at the moment, but it's very fascinating the way they phrase it. Drawing an analogy between the state of the natural capital of the UK and its value to the UK economy as a parallel with the National Health Service. So they're calling it the National Wealth Service, and how we should be investing in it to get the economic benefit for the UK. Very, very interesting way of phrasing it. I recommend everybody to have a look at it because it's underneath a lot of what we're talking about these 2 days. And then in relation to the fan, Robert and Quentin described how this may be a £10 billion fund in a phase one, primarily starting from the UK and looking outwards across Europe. In our discussions, we pontificated on the abject failure of DEFRA to get its big nature fund off the ground, announced 3 years ago, as far as I'm aware, still a black hole. The fact that Natural England itself has failed miserably in any monetisation of data it's paid for on public funds for the last 5 years as well. So we saw real advantage in the FAN anchoring seed corn investment from DEFRA for $1 billion of the 10 for 2 reasons. First of all, to get the fund up and running, but secondly, to bring the regulator on side with what this fund will deliver, because it will have an invested interest in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly Chris, you and I, so as fund managers, we're acutely aware of the role that organisations, governmental organisations, direct finance institutions, group like could be DEFRA in the UK, it could be the European Investment Bank, the role that those kind of organisations have in mobilising the first tranche of capital, the first closing of a fund, which then kind of sets the path for other kind of pure play private investors to be coming in at later closings in a fund, and that's increasingly important as we're moving into more complex areas beyond just kind of wind and solar, for example.
And I think that DEFRA is waiting to be led on it. I think if the right tour de force came together
good minister now.
the right way, it would listen and follow.
Good new minister.
Feel the need to control.
James, sir?
Well, I mean, Tony Juniper was very good on the radio this morning, as he regularly is. We have quite a keen minister, don't we, now, who's looked promising to work with, Steve Reed. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why I was excited by your idea. I think actually there is a moment that you could grasp. It's going to be very difficult because of those different types of capital to assemble. But there probably is a way of doing that if it's collaborative with other holders of that capital, i.e. it's not, you haven't wrapped everything in a single fund. You've created an institution that pulls nature investments towards funds that others might actually have responsibility for, but are connected. You know, that would be a novel structure. That's why I was asking questions about structure. But this is a moment where you could, I think, in this country, try really hard to create something that looked like FAN.
It's interesting to me over the last 2 days, because this isn't my space really, and sometimes you guys, I know you're talking English, but it doesn't feel like you're talking, I know the words, but I don't quite know what it all adds up to. But there's this, I think, real responsibility for you as a sector to really get hold of the environmental sector and lead them through this process in a way that allows them to kind of really benefit from it. Because they've got all the skills and knowledge around habitat creation and what's needed to be done. But sometimes when you guys speak, like, what on earth are you talking about? You know, so I think there's a kind of commonality of language that needs to be understood around this activity, and a collaboration around the environment sector and the finance sector that really kind of helps to build something of significance here. And I think that's the challenge. And I always worry when I look at the biodiversity net gain stuff in particular, that certain individuals are being, they're being a bit fast and loose with the kind of process. And I think if all it needs is a couple of bad stories on that to come out, and then suddenly you're in a negative situation where the whole biodiversity, the emphasis around regulation and it being a great bit of an intervention from government that could really make a difference, suddenly then kind of dissipates. So I think you've got a responsibility to try and kind of find a common language that we all understand and then can work with.
Well, you know, that point on collaboration is absolutely right. You know, bringing together the ideas and the passion from different parts of our economy, whether it's nature-based, whether it's finance-based, whether it's government institutions. We all need to be speaking to each other. We need to be coming up with the ideas. I mean, I think last 2 days have been fantastic. Hopefully we can use some of the takeaways that we've all had over these last 2 days and bring those ideas forward. To your point earlier, Dan, these government institutions are here to help catalyse these sectors which are struggling to bring capital to work. It's almost down to us to provide those ideas for them, and we can't just sit back and wait for regulation to change or for money to flow in. It's for us to be able to collaborate and bring forward ideas, bring forward new fund ideas and new concepts and build on that. So I think that for me is the biggest takeaway, having that collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. So collaboration being a key word there, and I think it's really interesting that two of the groups ending up at quite similar kind of endpoints, which is all about collaboration in terms of having diversified sources of funding, which helps bring down the cost of capital, which helps manage risk for all the different investors. And we've had I know there's been conversations over the last 2 days around things like, how do institutional investors access these assets? Is it through private markets or public markets? Private markets offers a great channel, but then if you're investing in a single interconnector project, for example, as we talked about, then there's a lot of risk in one asset. So therefore, investing through pooled vehicles is a way of everyone spreading their risk, and that helps to kind of mobilise capital.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up a little bit on time frames and having long-term perspectives, short-term perspectives. I feel like there is a feeling that institutional investors, the pension funds, insurance funds, have to think to some degree long-term, and therefore they are natural owners of assets in the long run in terms of having a long-term view on stewardship. But I thought what was interesting is some of the perspectives from people like Peter Smith from TPT, actually giving a bit more of a nuanced view, but actually the perspective from institutional investors can't always be long-term because it has to be, there are other factors that come to mind, whether it be regulatory, whether it be the time frame of the kind of pensioners involved and pension funds in runoff. So I wondered if any of the panelists had any reflections on kind of this notion of long-term versus short-term. James, perhaps,
Well, Peter's presentation was very good and very useful and very depressing. I mean, these are all perfectly rational reasons not to do what we know we have to do. And we've really got to get over that. I mean, it might well be that you might even be subconsciously making a plea for some kind of change in the rules, because it's absurd that we are still at the stage where we're finding reasons not to deploy the capital that we know we need in order to build, a better society for us to live in. And we have a vast amount of capital, our money, piled up in institutions that are not deploying it in investments that we need. And we just can't keep making excuses for this. But it probably does need some kind of intervention. Now, in theory, of course, they ought to be the perfect long-term investor in a real asset that produces real value, a proper long-term investment. Equally, they ought to be the font of capital for investment in the risk capital that is absolutely necessary for innovation. And yet, if you work out how much money is deployed every day by those institutions, tiny, absurdly small fractions go into either. Right? The vast majority goes into highly liquid, tradable instruments. Now, behind that, of course, there are companies that are making investments. So I don't deny that they have access to capital and they make real investments. But the total amount of capital that we have accumulated with our savings is simply not being invested in either natural capital or real assets or the kind of risk capital that we need for innovation. It's just not. And there's just no more excuses for that. How you make the intervention to change those patterns of behavior is part philosophy and part law, I think. But one would hope that there's more thinking coming from inside the industry of how to stop patterns of behavior that have got stuck, that are self-referential, self-justifiable, but not delivering the public good that we need.
Yep.
Or indeed investment returns that we should be getting from investing in real assets over the longer term.
Yeah, exactly.
Just another take on timeframes is the urgency. I think that we should all reflect on. We are a few months away from 2025, and it's only 5 years to 2030. That is not a long period of time at all. And here we are, sort of thinking about net zero targets, plowing money into sectors which need to decarbonise. It takes time, and I think yesterday there was a comment that it took a global pandemic to get decisions made in a matter of weeks and months. And here we are, sort of thinking about tackling red tape, regulation, which takes months and months and months. And you kind of think, well, why should it take so long? There's so much to do, and for me, that's almost one of the biggest hurdles is to get moving, because I think we'll have a bit of a wake-up call pretty soon.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, Dan. So the biggest tension we've had when creating the Wildflower Bank has been around timeframes. Two bits of that. One, our trustees being very worried about signing up to a 30-year obligation on an agreement, and the other is persuading a landowner, a farmer in particular, to put his land into that habitat for 30 years. Because most of the farmers are of a certain age, and they will be making a decision now based on what future generations of their family will be in. So I think that when I think about the time we've spent, those are the two, the longevity conversation from two different aspects of the bits that take the most time.
I want to make a point to follow up on that, actually, Dan. Before I do that, we're just going to read out a question that's come in, which I assume you guys can see on grid and interconnectors. You can't see it? No? Sorry. Okay, in that case, I'll read it out. So a question's come in, which is, in raising capital for grid, interconnectors and storage, how far should we present them to investors as facilitators of European competitiveness? The point that Nicholas made about the Draghi report. I'm just going to put that question out there and just offer it up if anyone wants to comment on it. Possibly, I'm thinking that Richard might want to comment on that question. I'll give you the option of that to have a think about that, and I can come back to you in a minute. So it's just a question about grid in particular kind of being a facilitator of European competitiveness. And that will be a nice bridge then to our third topic, which is about systems thinking. But yeah, so just to draw under a line under the notion of time frames, some of the other conversations I've heard is, Danny was just talking about their individual's perspective. So again, coming back to institutional investors, talking with underlying pensioners, it depends on the perspective of that underlying individual. If it's someone in their 20s or 30s, then they might be thinking, yes, I want my capital to be going to work in nature and energy transition. If it's someone who is later in life and is just thinking, I want an income stream, and that's kind of as simple as that, then it's kind of harder to have those conversations. And I would be really interested if anyone from the investor community wanted to add any comments around that, whether it be from perspective of participants in corporate pension schemes, industrial pension schemes, local government pension schemes. What do you hear in terms of the voices of your underlying pension participants, policy holders, and what's the kind of pushes there? Because that's such a crucial voice in this whole system. So if anyone did want to add any comments there, just put your hand up and we'll bring a mic over to you. Richard, would you like to comment on the question on grid and interconnectors to completely put you on the spot there? Apologies for that.
Thanks for the build-up there, Dan. It's been time to think. So I think it's more, that's how we present it to national governments. I mean, I think it's absolutely great that it is starting to be recognised that it's key to European competitiveness and country competitiveness. But that then needs to kind of flow into, okay, this is high priority, so we've got to open up regulation to allow private sector capital in, the point we're making on grid earlier, about changing permitting to allow us to get grid assets built quicker. So I think in terms of how that message is conveyed to investors, yes, it's helpful to say that, but I think the investor standpoint is, does that make it a good asset? And I think it's, if this is going to lead to regulatory change and open up sector to private capital. It's an investment opportunity, and it leads to the right regulation that makes it a good investment. So I think it's in both veins.
Yeah, I think that's really important. There is this, again, coming back, Chris, maybe to our perspective of fund managers, we're looking for, obviously, sectors, the energy transition or sectors within the energy transition. It could be interconnectors, it could be hydrogen, where we see particular tailwinds and particular applications. And we need to see that kind of tick in the box, that it's going to be supported by regulators. It might benefit from, projects of common interest status in the case of interconnectors. But we also need to look at the asset fundamentals. And that's, that hydrogen's a good example of that, isn't it? Where we see the big picture of green hydrogen, but also we're looking for particular kind of characteristics within an asset or a strategy.
I think hydrogen's a good case study to draw out. I mean, it clearly has a meaningful role to play in achieving net zero. We are sort of on the wave of understanding what the applications can be for that sector. There are many different projects that we see at Foresight in that sector, which some are very ambitious, perhaps overly ambitious in a way, but others are sensibly scaled, looking to, with a clear application, whether that's to industry, to manufacturing, to transport, and as you're right, it's about the underlying project, making sure that the feasibility of that is sound, and that'll attract capital.
Yep, exactly. So I want to come on to systems thinking and how this is relevant to our discussion. And I know lots of people are interested in this because I've had lots of conversations over the last 24 hours with people. I know there are views on this. I think you introduced systems thinking into the discussion. What's your kind of feeling in terms of the relevance of systems thinking to the problems we're trying to solve here?
I think it's hugely important, and we have to do the whole systems thinking, and that's one of the reasons why I really liked the last presentation, because I mean, if we look at transport, you can't separate train from aviation to shipping. You need to have a look at all together and how they're interlinked, and also in terms of the energy transition, how it's being distributed. It's hugely important to not just, linking that to security, to not just think national and regional, but also internationally. And it has been done, as we've been mentioned, through a few different industries. I think it's also important because, to your point, Dan, in terms of language, I think we need to be better at having a common language so that investors are talking so others understand. To your point, Laura, yesterday about innovation, I think that we need to understand innovation better and how that is linked to regulation, rather than saying, it takes an awful lot of time to get updated regulation. It does. So it's linking to your point, Bonti, maybe she's left. In terms of governance, I think it's hugely important when you look at systems thinking to see where are decisions taken, and do we have the right players in the room to also link it to the community, to the end users. So for me, systems thinking, when we look at the whole system, it's hugely important, and I think that will help to solve and highlight issues that needs to be solved so that we can actually get there in practice.
It's a systems problem. I mean, there aren't going to be solutions unless you think about the system as a whole. There's a good piece of work that was done by the Oxford Martin School, which does a lot of the interdisciplinaries of futurology. It's a very good centre at Oxford. And Cameron Hepburn led a project there that is to do with, I think it was called the post-carbon society or the post-carbon economy. And the approach that we took was to look at intervention points in a system. If you've got whatever resources you've got, they might be quite limited. There are points in a system that you can aim at quite accurately and make a big difference. But what are they? Think hard about how you might influence, shape, redirect a system with the resources that you've got. And clearly, investment power is very significant. But I mean, in the arcane world that it is, and I have entered into this world periodically and stepped back as well, some of the intervention points are really small, but have a massive effect. And I've had a go at a few and they haven't always worked, but disclosure was one of those intervention points, and I think it's had an effect, but only got us so far. Directors' duties is another intervention point. But the obligations of pension fund managers, whether it's fiduciary duty on the one hand or the ways in which they have to account to their beneficiaries, that there are all sorts of intervention points that make a profound difference to where the resources go to solve these problems. But you need to think about how they're all connected. If you don't have a systems view, the chances are you'll intervene heavy-handedly in the wrong place, or you'll cause a consequence you hadn't really thought about, or you haven't got the right people in the room to manage the next effect of the intervention that you make.
I'm going to ask Dan and James if you have any specific reflections on what we can learn from nature and systems thinking. I'll give you a minute to ponder on this, but in terms of the most recent kind of thinking around this and what we're learning from natural systems and how that might apply to our discussion, and also if you have any reflections, or if anyone else wants to chip in, feel free to. But I think just applying what you just said there, James, to energy, one of the things we would say as kind of energy investors is that 5 years ago you could invest in energy infrastructure investments and look at them in isolation.
Yeah.
You look at a subsidised Italian solar project or a German wind farm with a feed-in tariff, and that's almost like a bond. Whereas now if you're investing in anything, a solar project, a wind farm, a battery, a hydrogen production plant, you need to understand how the whole system works. Yeah. Because what is going to affect that value of that asset is changes in all the other parts of the system. You need to look at the build-out of the rate of renewables, you need to look at how batteries are being built out, how EVs are being charged, and crucially, coming back to interconnectors, how connected the system will be. So that comes back to this point about increasing complexity. Well, what about nature?
Dan, you go.
Oh my God, right.
I'll
Okay.
go
Well, I mean,
Let's talk about fungi, by the way. We actually can talk about fungi.
No, what I will say on the systems thing is that we're here, we've got a project called Spaceship Eden, which is how do we create everything that we create and use the resources we use in this site are recycled, and so you can have a whole circular system with us. And that's inspired by a guy called Buckminster Fuller and a book he wrote called Spaceship Earth. So your weekend reading is to go and have a look at that. That's if Tim Smith was here, he would be saying that to you. But the thing about nature, where you see the most biodiversity and where you see the most impact of nature are on the edges. So always think around that, I think, in terms of why is that happening in nature? And actually, when we think about these challenges and these processes, let's think on the edges of what we're doing in terms of how do you take new ideas and new innovations and pull them together to try and create this greater resilience. But this site is an amazing example of the power of nature. When you take something that's completely derelict, sterile, and you've produced something amazing like that. And nature will always look after itself. The problem is us.
Yeah.
And can we look after ourselves and nature at the same time?
There are so many things. I mean, the list is long. First of all, we have created in our economic system an imbalance between competition and cooperation. We simply haven't noticed how important cooperation is in ecosystems. Right? Really important. Secondly, we've created quite absurd dependencies. The presentation on food yesterday was a really stark example of our dependencies on very few commodities. Also, by the way, traded by very few companies, right? A ridiculous dependency. How can we really promote the diversity of our capitalist system if we finish up with 5/6 companies in the world completely dominating the trade in a few commodities? By the way, none of which have the price of water priced in. Right? So there's nothing about our commodity trade that connects with the brute reality of the hydrosphere. That's not very smart. Right? And then we also have to learn from nature that your phrase is good, looking at the edges. I was thinking of looking at the most vulnerable species as an indicator of what's next. Right? And we ought to do that in our societies too. And that's very much what my colleagues and I tried to do in the climate negotiations by working with the small island states, because they are the most vulnerable and they actually represent our interests best. But we tend not to do that in finance, right? We have very few incentives to do that. So I said, yeah, there's just lots to learn. And I think ecology, economy, and finance are fields that need to be brought much closer together in intellectual sense for us to make better decisions.
Absolutely. So I think one thing we'll do as a follow-up to this is we will circulate reflections on what we've talked about and also reading lists, a composite reading list where everyone can feed in their books.
Fucking lots.
Kate, I think you've got a question there.
Dan, can you give us an example of what you mean by looking at the edges? What?
Well, I think some of it is, well, funny enough, the first time we talked about it was bizarrely with Canary Wharf, because they had these kind of like, they were kind of trying to create a landscape around Canary Wharf, and it was straight lines here and straight lines there, and we were saying, actually, where the most interesting bits of nature are on the edges of things, so just loosen up those lines a bit and kind of create a bit of a mess between the edges and things. And I think it fed into what James was saying about the fact that, you know, one of our staff, Sam Smith, he lives in the Maldives, and he's got a 7-year-old son, and it's very kind of clear to him that his son might not be living in that island by the time he's Sam's age, because it's not going to exist and everything. So I think that idea that we need to look at our extreme islands and learn from them and nature, it's important.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on your point yesterday, Kate, when it comes to de-risking and for you to get your pension funds to actually invest more in nature. I think one big piece that is missing is data. We need more data. We need to be able to put numbers on nature, and we discussed it yesterday in the panel how difficult that is. I think that we have a lot to learn, and they need to be in this room as well. Insurance, and I'm not just talking about insurance as institutional investors. I'm talking about how they are de-risking and how they're actually putting numbers on this. It's also something that will help the global south, because when we're looking at nature, we can't just look at the nature here. It's the same as health. It is global. And so it's really important to look at parametric insurance. And it's we haven't got time to go through it in detail now, but that's something hugely important, which I think needs to be addressed as part of systems thinking.
Excellent, thank you. Christy, any final thoughts from your side or questions you wanted to ask at all?
I was actually thinking back to Nicholas's amazing opening speech and you know, reflections on the Draghi report, and also reflections on energy security. And I think you know, for me, you know, it goes beyond national security. It's around economic stability, about regional cooperation, ability to meet climate goals, and it's, you know, coming back to that collaboration point, you know, cross-border collaboration around this point, you know, integrated policy framework. So to me, that was a concept which really resonated, I thought, right from the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Like all good parties, I think we need to call things to an end, just as it feels like we're really getting to the really fun bit here as well. But that's great, because we're all going to go away.
Talk about it on the way home.
Exactly. And lots of conversations on the train back. Right, we're going to wrap things up. I just want to finish by saying, again, thank you so much for coming and kind of joining us. This is the second time we run the forum. We're keeping it relatively small for now to try and make the conversation flow well, but we want to create something that kind of builds over time and achieve something meaningful over time, because we think that the conversations that we have here are different to the kind of conversations you would have at a normal conference, and because of the kind of people we have from very different backgrounds, and that's kind of how the magic sort of happens. The final thought I wanted to leave people with was just this point about timeframes. And Chris, the point you made on urgency and this frustration we all feel that we see what can happen when we're faced with real adversity, whether it be, use the example of COVID, and suddenly vaccines actually can get rolled out much more quickly than we think. Or what happened in the Second World War when the US kind of overnight turned itself into a completely different kind of economic machine to rise to the challenge of the time. So why can't we do this with the challenges with nature and with the need for the energy transition and investment? And the thought that we posed you an almost impossible challenge this morning, which is to take on these 3 massive topics in 45 minutes and come up with something coherent, and all 3 of you teams did. So again, with a bit of time, pressure and urgency, we can achieve these things. And so hopefully that gives everyone a bit of optimism to take away. But thank you so much for making the trip down. We really appreciate it. Packed lunches are over there. Feel free to take them. If you're getting the first bus, then we'll be leaving relatively soon. If you're doing the final activity, then you've got a bit more time, so enjoy that. One more thing also, yeah, sorry.
Thank you very much for everyone that's worked in the background. It takes enormous amount of work to making an event like this happening. So Eden, marketing at Foresight, thank you so much. This is hugely important for everyone to get together. If it wasn't for you guys, it would not have happened. Thank you so much.
Yeah.